So hello and welcome to another waveform tutorial. So we're going to look today at the Group Humanizer Max Relied device from James Holden, which in my humble opinion is an amazing piece of kit. So you can see we've got a Group Humanizer master, which we have on a separate MIDI track with nothing else on it. There's no instrument, etc. Then in all our instrument tracks you can see we have Group Humanizer slave devices. So it's a to and fro. The Humanizer master sends out messages, timing messages to our slaves and vice versa from the slaves to the master. And the master also communicates in turn with Ableton's internal master clock. So just looking in the browser you can see we have Group Humanizer human input, Group Humanizer master, Group Humanizer mean follower and Group Humanizer slave. So we're only going to concentrate on the master and slave at the moment. The others are for live input, which I'm going to cover in another video. So let's look at the various parameters within the device. So we've got timing error, which is basically how a musician will drift away from a metronome or a click track over time. So it also suggests that we map them to a MIDI controller, which I've done, to a macro, and the same thing with our listening. So this counteracts some of this motor error factor. So motor error is, you could think of it something akin to the actual technical skill of each musician. So this is adding to the inconsistency from our timing error. So no musician is absolutely perfect, but a skilled musician will have a very low timing of this. So listening obviously is how much it listens to other things, surprisingly, and influence is how much other slaves listen to this particular slave. So again, a two-way process. Now, for influence, obviously drums, bass will usually come at the top of the list with high values. Things like pads that have slow, anything with a slow attack or strings will should have very little influence. So again, you've got two modes, metronome and adjust Ableton clock. So basically then, if you're adjusting Ableton clock, that's the actual slaves are controlling the clock rather than vice versa. So this is more used when we're talking about our live input mode. So we'll cover that in another video. So the threshold is how much leeway the slaves have to lag or to speed up without Ableton pulling things back into line. So just to remember, as humans, we don't want something that's 100% on the grid, because after a while we get used to it, we know what's going to happen next, and we start to lose interest. So having some of that human timing, that push and pull against a strict meter is really satisfying. So you might have heard of something called the pocket, which is like a tiny envelope of time before and after a beat in which that beat can land and it still sounds musically correct. So what you want is music that's in the pocket, not entirely hammered fast to the grid. So let's have a look at this in action. So I have a drum pattern, a bass pattern, and some basic chords. And we are just going to output the MIDI down below. So you can see I have a drums print track, and that's taking the MIDI from the drums track. Same thing with the bass, it's taking the MIDI from the bass track, and the chords print, it's taking it from the chords. So just make sure that's post FX, so we're getting all our goodness from the Group Humanizer. So you can notice I also have those tracks armed to record. So if I hit record now, so my first setting, we have our Group Humanizer turned off completely, so shock our MIDI should be exactly the same. So 100% bang on the grid. 8 bars to get a feel for it, and if we zoom in we can see that our beats are exactly the same, 100% bang on. Same with the bass, same with the chords. So if we engage our group Humanizer, make sure it's turned on and make sure all our slaves are also turned on, which they are. So now go back to our master Humanizer. So let's set things so they're as sloppy as possible, just to illustrate, over exaggerate and illustrate what's going on exactly. So I've got our threshold up high, timing error up high, and everything else pretty much off. So all the drift should be basically non-related between one track and the next, and it should sound pretty unmusical. So you can hear it kind of slipping in and out of time. Sounds like a very drunk band playing together. So now if we zoom in, we can see, so our kicks and snares, some are late, some are early, and we can see that our bass errors are also unrelated. So you can see they're also late and early and are not, there's no communication between those errors and our drum errors, so that's why it sounds so unmusical. So let's reset our settings to something more sensible. So low timing error value, increase our listening rate, bring up the influence of our drums and our bass to quite high values, reduce our threshold, and slightly increase our chords rate. Now let's see what happens. So now when we zoom in, we can see things are moving slightly off the grid. But you can see the mistakes, or should we call them mistakes, timing errors between the bass and our drums actually seem to be linked. So as the drums drift slightly off the metronome, so does the bass. So that's why it sounds more musical. Each individual instrument is listening to the other, just like a real band would. So if they drift off time together, it sounds musical. So one further thing to note is basically notes that have no gap in between them. So Group Humanizer doesn't like this so much. So you can see now I've put my hi-hats, there's no gap between the notes. And you can see now when we output, it's actually not outputting all of the hi-hats as it should do. It's missing some of them because of the timing error. It causes a little discrepancy. So if you have a lot of notes, one following the next on the same note lane, you've got to leave a small gap between them. So that's just one thing to be aware of. Okay, so setting up the Humanizer from scratch. So first things first, we need to create a MIDI track and to drop our Humanizer master into. So we create our MIDI track for our Group Humanizer master and drop it in. So this isn't going to make any sound of itself, it's just going to affect the timing of everything else, so we don't need any instrument or anything on it. So there's our Group Humanizer master device. You can see there's some info on the start page. For starters, I am going to group that so we can use the mapping of macros. and I'll show you why very shortly. So then we put our slave onto every track we have an instrument device on. So same thing, slave onto every device. My computer's a little bit sluggish, but it'll get there in the end. And finally, Humanizer slave on the drums. Okay, so we'll rename this Master Humanizer. Okay, so let's open up our macros and get mapping. So timing error first, so you can see we're going to map all of those to macro 1. Now it's recommended by James Holden himself in the notes that you map all the timing error and to one macro and listening to another, just so you can adjust them together. But sometimes it's actually nice to adjust them with slightly different values, so you don't always have to do this, but it's very convenient certainly. So again, all our listening are going to be mapped to macro 2. So now our influence, so we'll just name them first, I find it handier. So drum influence. Bass influence. So self-regulation. Threshold. We'll abbreviate that to self-reg threshold. Next will be self-reg mode. Then chords influence, and then melodies influence. And then we shall map those final parameters to the macros, and we are done. So there we go, our fully mapped macro, and then we just need to adjust our levels, our minimum maximum levels. So we don't need 120 milliseconds of timing error. Let's say 10 is enough for our purposes. You could go 20 if you wanted to be super loose. And I changed the listening values to maximum of 1 2 isn't really necessary. So just as a final little thing, I'm going to cover this in detail in a second tutorial, but I just want to show you the second mode, which is adjust timing of Ableton's clock. So basically now our slaves become the master, as it were, and they're going to push and pull. If you watch our master tempo, as I adjust the settings, you will see it start to drift over time. Now, if you're doing DJ related or electronic dance music, you're probably not going to use this. But for a live musician or someone actually playing electronic music with a live drummer, this could be potentially a game changer. So a few further experiments you could try would be, one is to actually drop a groove from Ableton's Groove Pool into your drum clip, and then use that. If you have a high influence setting value, you can use that to influence the rest of the tracks. So please check out James Holden's Group Humanizer, a really, really powerful Max for Live device. I'll do another tutorial in the next few weeks on live input. See you in the next video. Cheers.